like to be in a tsunami, what do you call that? One of those things. Anyway, thank you everybody for coming. And let's get straight into it. Introduction. I've spent 17 years researching this issue. First as a professor of chemistry. I specialized in environmental chemistry and toxicology. I did not want the issue. My wife persuaded me to get involved. I didn't want it because I was engaged full-time teaching chemistry, and all my weekends and holidays were mortgaged to helping communities around the world on waste management. That issue has taken me to 49 states in the United States, 7 provinces in Canada, and by the end of next month, to 60 different countries. So I didn't want a second issue, and I certainly didn't want a second issue which would stigmatize me as Looney Tunes, which is how people opposed to fluoridation have been portrayed for many years. However, I did start to read the literature that my wife gave me, and I was absolutely shocked and embarrassed that I'd been conned into thinking the opponents of fluoridation were crazy. Anyway, this work culminated in the publication of this book, which I wrote with 2 other scientists, James Beck, an MD, PhD from Calgary in Alberta, and Spenny Micklem, a biologist trained at Oxford and taught at Edinburgh University. So we had a chemist, a physicist, and a biologist. We were all retired. We all had plenty of time to read the literature. It's understated, not overstated. It can be read by the ordinary citizen, but for those who have scientific qualifications, every single argument is documented in the scientific literature. There's 80 pages of references. And that's a little bit like tonight's presentation. Hopefully, most of it is what I'm going to say is understandable. It's not submerged in jargon. You can understand it, but there are going to be places where you make a little note, go to the book, or go to the website to get more information. So, I'm going to start with 12 arguments against fluoridation. Then present the evidence of harm and argue that there's no adequate margin of safety to known health effects. Present the evidence that any benefit from swallowing fluoride is extremely weak. Answer the question, why do health agencies continue to push fluoridation? But you realize that that's difficult because you're trying to find a rational explanation for irrational behavior. Better alternatives to fight tooth decay. It's not enough to say no to something. It's much better if you can say yes to something else. And finally, some tips on how we might stop it in Sonoma County. Now, affecting change is like driving a nail through a piece of wood. The expert can sharpen the nail, but that expert can't push the nail through the piece of wood with their bare hands. You can't do it. So I cannot talk to anybody in this county and stop you getting fluoridation. But hopefully, if I sharpen a few nails tonight, you will be able to stop it coming into Sonoma County, because we need the hammer of public opinion to drive the nail home. Now that doesn't work unless you leave this auditorium tonight feeling that you understand these arguments well enough to use some. Not all of them, but some of them. If all you have to say at the end is, well, I heard Professor Connett and he was very convincing, then someone says to you, well, what did he tell you that convinced you? Oh, well, I don't remember that, but I do remember he was convincing. That's not good enough, okay? So hopefully you can remember these 12 arguments. I will be elaborating on each as we go through, but let's see at the end with how many you've remembered, and there will be a quiz. So the first argument is fluoride is not a nutrient. To demonstrate that a substance is a nutrient, you have to starve an animal of this substance in its diet and demonstrate that some disease occurs. That's never been done for fluoride. There's no such thing as a fluoride-deficient disease. Tooth decay is not caused by lack of fluoride, but by too much sugar. There's not one single biochemical process inside the body that needs fluoride to function properly. On the other hand, many biochemical processes are harmed by fluoride. And in fact, the first opponents of fluoridation were biochemists, and some of them very prominent biochemists. Biochemists who won the Nobel Prize. For example, James Sumner at Cornell won the Nobel Prize for his work on enzyme chemistry, and he warned fluoride poisons enzymes. You don't want it anywhere near your body, don't put it in the water. Now, for those who want to get right up to date with all the ways that fluoride is toxic in the body, the kind of things that it can affect, even at low doses, this article is a recent review article. That is only for people with a biochemical training. But it's useful for you to know that there is substance out there which documents all the nasty things that it can do. Now, is 1 part per million large or small? That's the level that we add fluoride, approximately, add fluoride to the water. 1 milligram per litre. Is that large or small? Well, the promoters say it is teeny weeny weeny. It's very, very small, they say. And they say this 1 part per million is 1 cent in $1,000. It is in $10,000. 1 cent in $10,000. Oh, I got my arithmetic wrong. It's 1 inch in 16 miles. Well, a toxicologist would laugh at that, because they would tell you whether 1 part per million is large or small depends upon the substance that you're talking about. If we were talking about dioxin, 1 part per million is 1,000,000 times too much. We are concerned about parts per trillion if it was dioxin. If it was arsenic, 1 part per million is 100 times the safe drinking water standard for arsenic. So it depends what the substance is before we are convinced that something is large or small. Now, the level which I think gives us an indication of the fact that 1 part per million is actually large is the level in mother's milk. The levels that we fluoridate at are actually about 200 times the level of fluoride in mother's milk. A mother that lives in a non-fluoridated community, on average, has about 0.004 parts per million. And that is 250 times less than 1 part per million. Or if you go to 0.7, it's 175 times less, but it's about 200 times less. So what does nature know that the American Dental Association does not know? It took millions of years to develop the mammal. We evolved from the sea. There was plenty of fluoride in the sea, 1.4 parts per million. And yet through all the twists and turns of evolution, with an adequate supply of fluoride to draw upon, nature decided that the baby needed very, very little. Our scientists, with a lack of humility, feel that they can give our babies 250 times more than nature. Argument number 3. Fluoridation is a very poor medical practice. Once we put a medicine in the water, we cannot control the dose. We can control the concentration, milligrams per litre. That our engineers can control at the waterworks. What we can't control is the dose in milligrams per day, because that depends on how many litres you drink. If you drink 1 litre at 1 part per million, you're going to get 1 milligram. If you drink 2 litres, you're going to get 2 milligrams. 3 litres, 3 milligrams. But it's worse than that. We can't control the dose because not only do people get fluoride from water, but today they get it from dental products, and they get it from air pollution, and they get it from pesticides, and they get it from fertilizers, and they get it from foods which have high natural levels, like tea and mechanically deboned meat. Secondly, once you put it in the water, you can't control who gets it. It goes to everybody. It goes to young and old, sick and well. people with poor nutrition, people with poor kidney function that certainly shouldn't get fluoride, people with borderline iodine deficiency, they shouldn't get fluoride, but it goes to everybody once you put it in the water. Ask the pharmacist the next time you go in, is there any drug in this store that you can give to anybody at any dose? And he's going to laugh in your face. Of course, it's not possible to do that. And finally, and most importantly, it violates the individual's right to informed consent to medication. If you're in any doubt about the need for doctors to follow this, look up the American Medical Association's webpage. They make it very clear what a doctor can and cannot do. The doctors are supposed to tell you what the benefits of the drug are, what the side effects of the drug are, and in theory, you are meant to decide for yourself whether you're going to take that drug. Now, I know in practice, most of us do what the doctor tells us, but in theory at least, we should have that right to say no if we don't want to take that medicine for some reason. And if at that point the doctor tried to force it upon you, he or she would lose their license. Very important. So what we've got here then is the whole community is doing to everyone what an individual doctor can do to no one. Force you to take medication. Now they sometimes say, we only deliver the water to the tap. You determine whether you're going to drink it or not. Now, maybe if you're middle income, maybe if you're high income, you have the luxury of getting an alternative water source. But that's certainly not true of families of low income. They don't have the luxury of getting an alternative source of water or buy expensive technology. The fourth argument is that the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, has never regulated fluoride for ingestion to fight tooth decay, either as a prescription drug or in water. According to the FDA, it is an unapproved drug. And as a result, they haven't required the same stringent testing that goes into other drugs. Other drugs require randomized clinical trials to demonstrate that the drug is both safe and effective. That's never been done with fluoridation. After 68 years, there's never been a randomized trial to demonstrate effectiveness or safety. Next, because the FDA has not approved this drug, it's not collecting from patients or doctors any information about side effects. And as I'm sure you're well aware, that the FDA does that, and after a while, if there's too many complaints of side effects, then the drug is taken off the market like virus. But that only came about because the FDA was tracking their responses. No tracking for fluoride. The fifth argument, it's ineffective. The evidence that water fluoridation, and I'm here talking about swallowing fluoride, reduces tooth decay is extremely weak. I shall be going into details later, but right now, if you go to chapters 6 through 8 in our book, we go through that lack of evidence. It was very weak at the beginning when it started, and it's weak today. So more upon that later tonight. 6, any benefit, and this is the reason, by the way, the reason that the evidence of swallowing fluoride reduces tooth decay is weak is because even now the promoters of fluoridation have admitted that it works topically. The predominant action of fluoride is topical. This was first stated by the Center for Disease Control in 1999, and at that point should have been a place where we stopped fluoridation. Once they admitted that the benefit of fluoride is topical, it no longer makes sense to swallow it and expose every tissue in the body to a toxic substance. Fluoridated toothpaste is universally available. The more difficult toothpaste to get in our society is non-fluoridated toothpaste. So it's readily available. Brush it on your teeth and spit it out. So this way you protect all the other tissues in the body from this toxic substance, and also you're not forcing it on people that don't want it. So they could have solved the medical issues, they could have solved the ethical issue with one change in strategy. Instead of delivering fluoride to people with the water supply, you educate the people to use fluoridated toothpaste. If you want fluoride. I don't want fluoride at all, so I haven't used fluoridated toothpaste for 16 years. But if I had to make a choice as a government official, I would rather they promote fluoridated toothpaste than fluoride in the water. There, incidentally, is the exact quote from the CDC. Fluoride carries preventive properties. Initially, were attributed to changes in enamel during tooth development. And that's why doctors gave tablets to pregnant women and drops to babies before their teeth had come out. The idea is that the fluoride would build up in the enamel and protect the teeth when they erupted into the mouth. However, laboratory and epidemiological research suggests that fluoride prevents dental caries predominantly after eruption of the tooth into the mouth, and its actions are primarily topical. It works on the outside of the tooth, not from inside the body. 7. The chemicals used in fluoridation are not pharmaceutical grade, not the same grade that we use in toothpaste, etc. These chemicals are industrial waste products derived from the air pollution control systems of the phosphate fertilizer industry. They use a spray of water to capture 2 very toxic gases which damage the environment near phosphate plants for many years. This spray of water captures hydrogen fluoride and silicon tetrafluoride and makes a substance called hexafluorosilicic acid. With all chemicals, the formula is easier to remember than the name. So hexafluorosilicic acid is H2SI, small I for silicon, F6. Hexa, meaning 6. Hexafluorosilicic acid, the correct name. Anyway, cut a long story short, they can't dump this stuff into the sea by international law. They can't dump it locally because it's too concentrated. But if someone buys it from them, it then becomes a product. And then we put it in our drinking water supply. And there's a famous statement from Rebecca Hanmer at the EPA, who's saying, this is a wonderful solution. This is a solution to an air pollution problem and gives us a cheap chemical to use in fluoridation programs. Except she forgot to mention that this hexafluorosilicic acid contains all kinds of contaminants. Not only in Florida they mine this phosphate rock for fertilizer, they mine it for uranium. And so there's some small quantities of radioactive isotopes in this. But the one that's simplest to remember is there's arsenic in there. And arsenic is a known human carcinogen. So inevitably, the use of these chemicals which contain arsenic will increase cancer rates in the United States. This is regardless of whether fluoride itself causes cancer. Arsenic is a known human carcinogen. We can argue about how much the rates of cancer will increase, but they can't argue that they won't increase, because as far as the EPA is concerned, it will cause cancer right down to 1 molecule. Argument number 8. Our children are being overexposed to fluoride. This is particularly relevant to Sonoma County, because you can benefit from this information, or your officials can benefit from this information. According to the Center for Disease Control, a report in 2010, 41% of American children aged 12 to 15 have some form of dental fluorosis. This is a mottling, a discoloration of the enamel, little white patches, varying in severity. And it is a well-known marker, visible marker, that that child has received too much fluoride during the development of its teeth. When they started fluoridation in 1945, they thought they would limit dental fluorosis to 10% of the population. And that was the trade-off. We would reduce tooth decay, they thought, and only get 10% of the kids would get the very, very mildest form of dental fluorosis. Look at, run the clock forward, we're 4 times worse than that. 41% of American kids, and not all in its very mild form. Later on, I should be showing you pictures of what dental fluorosis looks like and give you the percentages of what American children have. 9, teeth are not the only tissue impacted by fluoride. In my view, it will be a biochemical miracle if the only tissue that was affected by fluoride's very active biological properties would be the growing tooth cells. But the thing is, we can see this effect, you see, so they can't deny it. They cannot deny dental fluorosis because you can see it with the visible eye. But they do deny impacts on the bone, they do deny impacts on the brain, and impacts on the thyroid system. Why? Because we can't see it. And because we're not doing any studies to see if it's happening. If you don't look, you don't find. This is what Arvid Carlsson led the successful campaign against fluoridation in Sweden in the 70s. And one of the things he said at that time was, one wonders what an increase in exposure to fluoride, such as occurs with bottle-fed infants, may mean for the development of the brain and other tissues. A very, very prophetic statement, as we shall see. I'll be looking at effects on the brain later. 10, there's no adequate margin of safety to protect the whole population. And here you have to guard against 2 simple, simplistic statements from proponents. They don't understand the difference between concentration and dose. So if there's an effect, say at 3 parts per million, they will say, but that's 4 times the level that we're planning, 0.7. As if that was some kind of protection. Somebody drinking water at 0.7 parts per million could get a higher dose than someone drinking fluoridated water at 3 parts per million. Again, it depends upon how much water people drink. So in terms of the dose, the 2 populations, one drinking water at 0.7 and one drinking water at 3 parts per million, would overlap. The doses would overlap. So to say it's higher concentration is to miss the point and indicate that very well qualified health officials do not understand the first lesson in toxicology, which is the difference between concentration and dose. The second thing is this notion of what is high, when what we should be doing is to see if there's an adequate margin of safety. In fact, these are words that you never hear coming out of the mouths of a fluoridation proponent. You hear high and low. What you don't hear is margin of safety. And let me put it in a nutshell, and I'll come back and elaborate on this more with an example later on. What we mean by margin of safety is this. Standard toxicology. If you're looking at a toxic substance, you find the lowest dose of your toxic substance that causes harm in a small study group. You usually only have a small study group. And then, having found that dose, to determine the safe dose for a large population containing millions of people, you divide by 10. It's called the intra-species safety factor. You divide by 10 to get the dose to protect the most vulnerable person in your population. Divide by 10. Some people would say you need to divide by more to protect for babies and young children, but at least 10. So you find your dose which causes harm, divide by 10, and that's what we would call the safe reference dose. Very important. I'll be coming back to that. I would stake my whole political, my scientific reputation on there being no adequate margin of safety to protect against several endpoints. Not an adequate margin of safety to protect against hip fractures for lifelong exposure. Not enough margin of safety to protect against arthritic symptoms. Not enough margin of safety to protect against lowering thyroid function. And not enough margin of safety to protect against the lowering of IQs in children, which I shall come back to. And let's also make that something else clear. Obviously, there's an argument about whether or not fluoridation causes harm. And that's what a large amount of this presentation is about, is looking at the literature that indicates that there is likely to be harm from fluoridation. But there's no argument about something else, and that is there's no argument that fluoride damages health. Fluoride, the iron, the salt, whatever you call it, the compound, has damaged the lives of millions of people in India, China, parts of Africa, parts of Mexico, which have high natural levels of fluoride. And those countries, particularly China and India, are spending a fortune trying to get fluoride out of their water, whilst we are trying to put it in. So more on fluoride's impact on the brain to come. Fluoridation may actually be killing a few men each year. Some studies have found an association between exposure to fluoride at a particular time in a young male's life and a frequently fatal bone cancer called osteosarcoma. Now, you know, the evidence of reducing tooth decay would have to be pretty strong, and the evidence for that pretty weak for any responsible official to say we should go on. In other words, can you imagine any official saying there's a certain amount of tooth decay which we could save, and it doesn't matter if a few young children die of osteosarcoma each year? I don't think that is reasonable. So more on fluoride and osteosarcoma to come. 12. Most countries in the world do not fluoridate their water. In fact, more than half the people drinking artificially fluoridated water live in North America. About 400 million worldwide, over 200 million in America. 97% of European countries do not fluoridate their water. There they are. These are the 97% of European countries that do not fluoridate their water. Some started, like the Netherlands, but stopped. Some had one town fluoridated, Finland, Sweden, Germany, and stopped. Eastern Germany was fluoridated until the two Germanys combined, and they stopped. Switzerland had a few cities fluoridated, they have stopped. 4 of those countries fluoridate their salt. But here the customer, the patient, the individual has some choice in the matter. You can either buy fluoridated salt or non-fluoridated salt. It's up to you. But you're not forcing it on other people, unless you're a cook. Okay. But according to World Health Organization data, tooth decay in 12-year-olds, it's coming down as fast in the fluoridated as the non-fluoridated countries. So here's the time scale. Here we have data from the 1960s through to the present. And this is tooth decay in 12-year-olds. And you notice it's coming down as fast as these top 12 fluoridated countries. Those in the, I think it's green, those are non-fluoridated countries. United Kingdom has about 10% fluoridated, and the red box are the fluoridated ones. I don't think you can tell the difference between the fluoridated and the non-fluoridated countries as far as the decline in tooth decay. In other words, tooth decay has been coming down in Western countries throughout the industrialized world in the same period. And if you look at the results today, it's a wash. You can't tell the difference in tooth decay between some of these countries which are fluoridated and some of those countries which are non-fluoridated. Part 2.